secrets hide in every shadow.
It was the sort of December morning that belonged in an illustrated postcard. A sky the color of pale pearl, roofs edged with white, and a hush over the village of St. Mildred's, as though the snow itself demanded quiet. Inside the vicarage drawing room, the scent of pine mingled with orange peel and cloves. A large Christmas tree, freshly delivered from the hall, stood in the bay window, half-dressed with glass baubles and strands of silver tinsel. The vicar's wife, Harriet Larch, hovered nearby, fussing over its placement with the air of a general arranging troops. "We'll have the lights on by this evening," she said, stepping back to appraise the tree. If only Arthur wouldn't insist on hanging that dreadful Father Christmas near the top. Her husband, the Reverend Larch, smiled mildly over the rim of his spectacles. "Tradition, my dear. He's been on our tree since I was a boy." Miss Marple, seated near the fire with her knitting, looked up with a faint twinkle. "Traditions have a way of clinging, even when they're rather shabby," she observed. "Still, one hesitates to break them. A little untidiness is often the price of sentiment." Outside, the crunch of wheels on snow announced the arrival of more guests. The doorbell pealed, and soon the room filled with the bustle of coats and cheerful voices. Colonel and Mrs. Faraday entered first, rosy-cheeked from the cold, followed by young Geraldine Palmer, who worked at the post office, and Julian Bream, a visiting historian staying at the inn. They had all come, as Harriet Larch declared, to help trim the tree before the village carol service. Hot punch was ladled into mugs, ribbons and ornaments were passed about, and for a time the only sound was the rustle of paper and the occasional clink of glass. Even Miss Marple joined in, though her hands were far more adept at arranging sprigs of holly than untangling the electric lights. It was Jerry Palmer who found the note. She had stooped to pick up a fallen bauble when she noticed a small envelope tucked behind the lowest branches. "Look, someone's left a message," she said, holding it up. Harriet Larch laughed. "Perhaps it's a riddle for the carol service." But when Julian Bream took the envelope and unfolded its single sheet, his brow furrowed. "It's not a riddle," he said slowly. Well, listen," he read aloud in a steady voice. "To the one who knows what was done beneath the yew, the hour is close, the reckoning due." There was a startled silence. Even the vicar looked perturbed. "Somebody's little joke," Colonel Faraday declared, though without conviction. "Nasty sort of joke, if you ask me." Miss Marple's needles clicked once, twice, and paused. She regarded the note gravely, though she said nothing. The mood tried to recover, but an unease had settled over the gathering like a fine mist. Conversation faltered. The baubles seemed suddenly garish. Harriet Larch insisted they continue decorating. "We shan't let a silly scrap of paper spoil things." Yet her hands trembled as she placed a china angel on a branch. When dusk fell, they lit the candles along the tree's lower limbs for a brief test, the fairy lights having proved temperamental. The flames cast a warm shimmer across the room. For a moment the atmosphere softened again. That was when the scream rang out. It came from the hall, sharp, abrupt, and unmistakably shocked. Everyone turned as Jerry Palmer stumbled back through the doorway, her face drained of color. "In the study," she gasped. "There's someone on the floor." The vicar hurried past her, the colonel close behind. Harriet clutched her pearls, while Julian Bream set down his mug with trembling fingers. Miss Marple rose carefully, folded her knitting, and followed with quiet steadiness. The study lay at the far end of the passage, its door ajar. Inside, the fire had burned low, casting a reddish glow over the carpet. A man lay sprawled near the hearth, one arm flung outward, the other tucked beneath him. A dark stain spread across the front of his woolen waistcoat. "Good heavens," murmured the vicar, kneeling. "It's Henry Cottrell." "Quite dead," said Colonel Faraday after a brief examination. "Shot by the look of it," Harriet gave a strangled cry. "But Henry was only to call for tea. He said he'd stop in before going up to the hall." Miss Marple stepped closer, her gaze moving from the body to the half-open window, to the scattering of papers on the desk. She noted the overturned chair, the faint smell of gunpowder, and, almost hidden by the skirting board, a second envelope, identical to the one found in the tree. No one spoke as she bent and picked it up. She opened it delicately. Inside was a single line, written in the same firm, slanting hand. "Beneath the tree, truth waits." Snow was falling again outside, soft and silent. Within the vicarage study, the party stood frozen, their faces pale in the flickering light. It was Harriet who broke the silence at last. "We must telephone the police," she whispered. "Yes," said Miss Marple quietly, her expression unreadable. "The police, by all means." She slipped the envelope into its sleeve and laid it on the desk. Then she looked once more at Henry Cottrell, her eyes thoughtful, almost sorrowful. For Miss Marple had already begun, in the calm recesses of her mind, to arrange the morning's small oddities into their proper places: the positioning of the Christmas tree, the curious rhyme about the yew, the particular way Henry Cottrell's boots were dusted with snow, despite the mat at the door. Somewhere among those details lay the story of how a man had come to die beneath a Christmas tree, and why someone had chosen to leave a warning written in rhyme. Outside, the church bells began to chime the hour, each note carrying over the whitened roofs of St. Mildred's, heralding not only Christmas, but also the beginning of a mystery only Miss Marple could truly see. Morning came pale and brittle, with frost veining the windows of every cottage in St. Mildred's. News of Henry Cottrell's death had travelled faster than the snowflakes drifting from the sky. By the time the church bell struck 9, the village was already humming with speculation, like bees awakened too early in winter. At the post office, Mrs. Finch leaned over the counter toward a cluster of patrons pretending to browse envelopes. "Shot, they say," she whispered, eyes round behind her spectacles. "In the vicarage study, of all places. Fancy such a thing happening there." Old Mr. Pritchard tapped his cane on the floor. "Mark my words, it'll be some tramp after silver. Henry always did carry a decent watch." "Tramps don't write rhymes," said young Mary Cottrell, Henry's niece, who had come for stamps but found herself rooted to the spot. Her cheeks were blotched from crying. "They wouldn't leave. Messages—" The talk quieted at that, though Mrs. Finch's mouth still twitched with words unsaid. Outside, a constable led Sergeant Wilkes through the lane toward the vicarage gate. People turned discreetly, eyes following them until they disappeared behind the holly hedge. Inside the vicarage kitchen, Harriet Larch sat stiffly at the table, a teacup cooling between her hands. Arthur Larch stood at the stove attempting eggs, though his thoughts were clearly elsewhere. He stirred twice in the same direction and let the spoon clatter onto the plate. Colonel and Mrs. Faraday had remained overnight for support, while Julian Bream hovered by the window, peering through the curtains at the snow. Miss Marple, having risen earlier than anyone, was quietly darning a glove by the hearth. She glanced up now and then, apparently absorbed only in her work, though she missed little of the exchanges around her. "I scarcely slept," Harriet murmured, "to think Henry lying there all night with the snow coming down. Such a dreadful business." Arthur placed a tentative hand on her shoulder. "The police will soon sort it, my dear. We mustn't distress ourselves more than necessary." Colonel Faraday cleared his throat. "Dashed bad show," he said for perhaps the 5th time. "But I dare say they'll discover it was an intruder. Shot through the window, perhaps." Julian Bream shook his head slowly. "Windows don't write warnings either," he remarked. "And I'm not convinced anyone could have approached without leaving tracks. I saw none in the garden when we looked." Miss Marple set aside her darning and regarded the young man with interest. "A most sensible observation," she said mildly. "Fresh snow records visitors very clearly, I always think." The arrival of Sergeant Wilkes broke the tense quiet. A solid man with wind-reddened cheeks, he entered with a purposeful stride, accompanied by Constable Graves carrying a battered notebook. They offered polite greetings before Wilkes cleared his throat. "Right," he said briskly. "I'll need statements from each of you. Dr. Shaw's examined the deceased. Time of death appears to be between 4 and 5 yesterday afternoon. That'd be while you were all decorating." "Yes," Harriet replied faintly. "We were trimming the tree just there in the drawing room. Anyone leave the room?" It was the sort of December morning that belonged in an illustrated postcard. A sky the color of pale pearl, roofs edged with white, and a hush over the village of St. Mildred's as though the snow itself demanded quiet. Inside the vicarage drawing room, the scent of pine mingled with orange peel and cloves. A large Christmas tree, freshly delivered from the hall, stood in the bay window, half dressed with glass baubles and strands of silver tinsel. The vicar's wife, Harriet Larch, hovered nearby, fussing over its placement with the air of a general arranging troops. "We'll have the lights on by this evening," she said, stepping back to appraise the tree. If only Arthur wouldn't insist on hanging that dreadful Father Christmas near the top. Her husband, the Reverend Larch, smiled mildly over the rim of his spectacles. "Tradition, my dear." "He's been on our tree since I was a boy." Miss Marple, seated near the fire with her knitting, looked up with a faint twinkle. "Traditions have a way of clinging, even when they're rather shabby," she observed. "Still, one hesitates to break them. A little untidiness is often the price of sentiment." Outside, the crunch of wheels on snow announced the arrival of more guests. The doorbell pealed, and soon the room filled with the bustle of coats and cheerful voices. Colonel and Mrs. Faraday entered first, rosy-cheeked from the cold, followed by young Geraldine Palmer, who worked at the post office, and Julian Bream, a visiting historian staying at the inn. They had all come, as Harriet Larch declared, to help trim the tree before the village carol service. Hot punch was ladled into mugs, ribbons and ornaments were passed about, and for a time the only sound was the rustle of paper and the occasional clink of glass. Even Miss Marple joined in, though her hands were far more adept at arranging sprigs of holly than untangling the electric lights. It was Jerry Palmer who found the note. She had stooped to pick up a fallen bauble, when she noticed a small envelope tucked behind the lowest branches. "Look, someone's left a message," she said, holding it up. Harriet Larch laughed. "Perhaps it's a riddle for the carol service," but when Julian Bream took the envelope and unfolded its single sheet, his brow furrowed. "It's not a riddle," he said slowly. Well, listen," he read aloud in a steady voice. "To the one who knows what was done beneath the yew, the hour is close, the reckoning due." There was a startled silence. Even the vicar looked perturbed. "Somebody's little joke," Colonel Faraday declared, though without conviction. "Nasty sort of joke, if you ask me." Miss Marple's needles clicked once, twice, and paused. She regarded the note gravely, though she said nothing. The mood tried to recover, but an unease had settled over the gathering like a fine mist. Conversation faltered. The baubles seemed suddenly garish. Harriet Larch insisted they continue decorating. "We shan't let a silly scrap of paper spoil things." Yet her hands trembled as she placed a china angel on a branch. When dusk fell, they lit the candles along the tree's lower limbs for a brief test, the fairy lights having proved temperamental. The flames cast a warm shimmer across the room. For a moment the atmosphere softened again. That was when the scream rang out. It came from the hall, sharp, abrupt, and unmistakably shocked. Everyone turned as Jerry Palmer stumbled back through the doorway, her face drained of color. "In the study," she gasped. "There's someone on the floor." The vicar hurried past her, the colonel close behind. Harriet clutched her pearls while Julian Bream set down his mug with trembling fingers. Miss Marple rose carefully, folded her knitting, and followed with quiet steadiness. The study lay at the far end of the passage, its door ajar. Inside, the fire had burned low, casting a reddish glow over the carpet. A man lay sprawled near the hearth, one arm flung outward, the other tucked beneath him. A dark stain spread across the front of his woolen waistcoat. "Good heavens," murmured the vicar, kneeling. "It's Henry Cottrell. Quite dead," said Colonel Faraday after a brief examination. "Shot by the look of it." Harriet gave a strangled cry. "But Henry was only to call for tea. He said he'd stop in before going up to the hall." Miss Marple stepped closer, her gaze moving from the body to the half-open window, to the scattering of papers on the desk. She noted the overturned chair, the faint smell of gunpowder, and, almost hidden by the skirting board, a second envelope, identical to the one found in the tree. No one spoke as she bent and picked it up. She opened it delicately. Inside was a single line, written in the same firm, slanting hand. "Beneath the tree, truth waits." Snow was falling again outside, soft and silent. Within the vicarage study, the party stood frozen, their faces pale in the flickering light. It was Harriet who broke the silence at last. "We must telephone the police," she whispered. "Yes," said Miss Marple quietly, her expression unreadable. "The police, by all means." She slipped the envelope into its sleeve and laid it on the desk. Then she looked once more at Henry Cottrell, her eyes thoughtful, almost sorrowful. For Miss Marple had already begun, in the calm recesses of her mind, to arrange the morning's small oddities into their proper places. The positioning of the Christmas tree, the curious rhyme about the yew, the particular way Henry Cottrell's boots were dusted with snow, despite the mat at the door. Somewhere among those details lay the story of how a man had come to die beneath a Christmas tree, and why someone had chosen to leave a warning written in rhyme. Outside, the church bells began to chime the hour, each note carrying over the whitened roofs of St. Mildred's, heralding not only Christmas, but also the beginning of a mystery only Miss Marple could truly see. Morning came pale and brittle, with frost veining the windows of every cottage in St. Mildred's. News of Henry Cotterell's death had travelled faster than the snowflakes drifting from the sky. By the time the church bell struck 9, the village was already humming with speculation, like bees awakened too early in winter. At the post office, Mrs. Finch leaned over the counter toward a cluster of patrons pretending to browse envelopes. "Shot, they say," she whispered, eyes round behind her spectacles. "In the vicarage study, of all places. Fancy such a thing happening there. Old Mr. Pritchard tapped his cane on the floor. Mark my words, it'll be some tramp after silver." Henry always did carry a decent watch. "Tramps don't write rhymes," said young Mary Cotterell, Henry's niece, who had come for stamps but found herself rooted to the spot. Her cheeks were blotched from crying. They wouldn't leave. "Messages." The talk quieted at that, though Mrs. Finch's mouth still twitched with words unsaid. Outside, a constable led Sergeant Wilkes through the lane toward the vicarage gate. People turned discreetly, eyes following them until they disappeared behind the holly hedge. Inside the vicarage kitchen, Harriet Larch sat stiffly at the table, a teacup cooling between her hands. Arthur Larch stood at the stove attempting eggs, though his thoughts were clearly elsewhere. He stirred twice in the same direction and let the spoon clatter onto the plate. Colonel and Mrs. Faraday had remained overnight for support, while Julian Bream hovered by the window, peering through the curtains at the snow. Miss Marple, having risen earlier than anyone, was quietly darning a glove by the hearth. She glanced up now and then, apparently absorbed only in her work, though she missed little of the exchanges around her. "I scarcely slept," Harriet murmured. "To think Henry lying there all night with the snow coming down. Such a dreadful business." Arthur placed a tentative hand on her shoulder. "The police will soon sort it, my dear. We mustn't distress ourselves more than necessary." Colonel Faraday cleared his throat. "Dashed bad show," he said for perhaps the 5th time. "But I dare say they'll discover it was an intruder. Shot through the window, perhaps." Julian Bream shook his head slowly. "Windows don't write warnings either," he remarked. "And I'm not convinced anyone could have approached without leaving tracks. I saw none in the garden when we looked." Miss Marple set aside her darning and regarded the young man with interest. Almost there was a moment's hesitation. Then Julian Bream spoke. "I stepped out briefly to fetch a book I'd promised to show Jerry Palmer. Only a moment, and Miss Palmer." "She went to answer the telephone," Harriet supplied. "It rang from the hall, I remember." Wilkes made notes, then turned to Arthur Larch. "You, sir?" "I remained by the fire, except when I fetched more holly from the pantry." Colonel Faraday straightened. "I stayed put, helping with the lights." Miss Marple smiled pleasantly when Wilkes looked her way. "I was present all the while," she said. "Knitting doesn't carry one far." The sergeant sniffed, unconsciously respectful of her calm. "And Mr. Cotterell, why was he visiting?" Harriet's lips trembled. "He said he wished to speak with Arthur about a parish matter before calling at the hall." Wilkes rubbed his chin. "Did anyone hear the shot?" "They exchanged sensible observation," she said mildly. "Fresh snow records visitors very clearly, I always think." The arrival of Sergeant Wilkes broke the tense quiet. A solid man with wind-reddened cheeks, he entered with a purposeful stride, accompanied by Constable Graves carrying a battered notebook. They offered polite greetings before Wilkes cleared his throat. "Right," he said briskly. "I'll need statements from each of you. Dr. Shaw's examined the deceased. Time of death appears to be between 4 and 5 yesterday afternoon. That'd be while you were all decorating?" "Yes," Harriet replied faintly. "We were trimming the tree just there in the drawing room. Anyone leave the room?" As they parted, Miss Marple watched the girl hurry off, snowflakes gathering on her hat. She filed the information carefully among other impressions. The notes, the window, Julian's thud, Henry's own revolver. That afternoon brought another visitor to the vicarage, Mary Cotterell, Henry's niece. She arrived with a pale face and determined step, clutching a sealed envelope. "This came for Uncle Henry yesterday," she said, handing it to Arthur. "It was delivered to my cottage by mistake." Arthur examined the plain envelope, addressed in the same hand as the messages. Inside lay a single sheet, bearing only 3 words. "Remember the U." Silence followed as they read the message. Miss Marple broke it with a thoughtful hum. "The U again." "That tree is most insistent." Harriet looked bewildered. "There's an old yew by the churchyard gate, isn't there?" Arthur nodded. Planted centuries ago, they say. But what could Henry have to do with it? Miss Marple refrained from answering. She was thinking of her morning walk, of how the snow beneath the yew had been oddly disturbed, as though someone had paced there recently, despite the rest of the churchyard being untouched. As dusk crept in, Miss Marple sat by the parlour window, gazing at the drifting flakes. She considered Henry Cotterell's reputation, a quiet man, steady in business, fond of village causes. Yet people often hid shadows behind placid facades. Her long life had taught her that human nature was rarely as simple as it appeared over tea. Julian Bream entered, carrying a map he had borrowed from the hall library. He laid it on the table, tracing a finger over the lanes. "I was thinking," he said, "about where Mr. Cotterell might have come from before calling here. There are only two approaches without passing the main square, the track by the church and the one past the mill." Miss Marple leaned forward to look. "Indeed," she murmured. "And yesterday's snow would have revealed his footprints." Julian nodded. The sergeant said there were two sets leading to the vicarage door. Mr. Cotterell's and someone else's, smaller perhaps, but blurred. "Curious," Miss Marple observed. "Blurring may occur when a person lingers, or when someone follows closely." She thanked Julian for the map and returned to her knitting, though her mind was far from the even stitches. She thought instead of that quiet yew tree, of blackmail hinted in Jerry's words, and of the way Henry had come into the house holding something clasped beneath his coat, a detail Harriet had mentioned almost unconsciously over tea. That night, when the others had retired, Miss Marple sat alone beside the fading fire. Snow tapped gently at the panes, and the vicarage lay steeped in shadow. She reviewed the day's fragments, knitting them into a tentative pattern. There was, she felt, a story beneath the surface, an old wrong perhaps, something buried like a seed waiting for frost to loosen the ground. She gazed at the twinkling tree in the corner, its ornaments gleaming faintly. Beneath its branches lay packages prepared for the carol service. One parcel sat slightly apart from the others, tied with twine instead of ribbon. Miss Marple rose and approached, lifting it carefully. Inside she found hymn sheets and a small box containing a brass lantern, one of those Henry was meant to collect. She noted, with a faint frown, that a corner of the paper was smudged with dark soil. Replacing the parcel exactly as she had found it, she settled back into her chair. A faint smile touched her lips, not of pleasure but of quiet certainty that the threads were beginning to show their shape. Murder, she reflected, was like frost on glass. At first an opaque blur, but soon the pattern revealed itself to those willing to look with patient eyes. Snow had thickened during the night, laying a fresh white quilt over the village. By mid-morning the sun glittered across rooftops, but the chill was so sharp that smoke from chimneys rose in stiff, straight plumes. At the vicarage, the household gathered reluctantly for breakfast, the strain of recent events showing in every gesture. Even the silver on the table looked subdued, as if mourning the death that still shadowed the rooms. Sergeant Wilkes arrived promptly, brushing snow from his coat as Harriet ushered him into the drawing-room. He brought with him an air of brisk purpose, though his eyes were tired. "We've made some headway," he announced, accepting the tea Harriet offered. "I've been over Mr. Cotterell's papers. There's a receipt for a sum withdrawn from the bank 2 days ago, £50 in notes. Not a penny of it on him when he died." Arthur Larch frowned. £50 is a considerable amount for Henry. Indeed. Wilkes flipped open a small notebook. "We've also examined the revolver. Clean, recently oiled, one chamber empty. Whoever fired it knew how to handle a firearm." He paused, his gaze shifting from Arthur to Julian Bream. "Mr. Bream, you were in the hall when you heard that thud." Julian straightened from the mantelpiece where he had been leaning. "Yes, it was quick, soft like a book falling. Would you say it came from the study?" Julian hesitated. "Possibly, though it might have been the drawing-room. I wasn't paying close attention." Wilkes nodded slowly. "Miss Marple, you walked round the churchyard yesterday morning. Did you happen to notice anyone?" Miss Marple looked up from her knitting with the mildest of smiles. "Only young Michael Price sweeping snow from the church path. He mentioned he'd been asked by Mr. Cotterell to clear the way to the old yew. A curious request for so early in the day." Wilkes grunted. "Price, eh? I'll speak with him." He shut the notebook. "We've also been told that Mr. Cotterell was involved in some sort of dispute recently. Any of you aware of it?" There was an uneasy silence. Harriet's hand fluttered to her pearls, while Arthur cleared his throat but said nothing. It was Jerry Palmer, arriving with a parcel of hymn books, who finally spoke. "I heard him quarrelling by the hall," she admitted shyly. "He said something about not being pushed any further." Julian exchanged a quick glance with Harriet. "Perhaps it concerned church funds," he suggested lightly, but no one seemed convinced. After Wilkes left to question Michael Price, Miss Marple wandered into the study. She moved slowly, examining the room as though for the first time. The curtains were half drawn against the winter glare. The hearth smelled faintly of charred paper. Bending, she inspected the area near the skirting board where the second note had lain. The tiniest thread of dark wool clung there, almost invisible against the carpet. She retrieved it delicately and tucked it into her knitting bag. Later that morning, Miss Marple accepted Harriet's invitation to accompany her on a visit to Lady Hawthorne at the Hall. The older woman, elegant despite the severity of her mourning black, received them in a morning room overlooking snowy lawns. Tea was served in fragile cups, and an air of restrained curiosity hovered above their talk. "Such a dreadful business," Lady Hawthorne sighed. "Poor Henry. He was always reliable. Managed the estate accounts with the utmost discretion." "Did he seem troubled of late?" Miss Marple asked, stirring her tea with absent care. Lady Hawthorne pursed her lips. "Come to think of it, yes. He asked to see certain papers concerning land leases. I thought it odd. Those matters were settled years ago. He mentioned the old yew too, wanted to know when it was planted and whether any burial plots nearby had been disturbed." "Burial plots?" Harriet repeated, startled. "Oh yes," Lady Hawthorne replied calmly. "That section of the churchyard was once a resting place for certain tenants, though records are sparse." Miss Marple inclined her head thoughtfully. "A history of the parish often lingers in unexpected places." When they returned to the village, Sergeant Wilkes was at the gate speaking with Michael Price, the church handyman. The boy shuffled awkwardly, snow clinging to his boots. "I only did what Mr. Cottrell asked," he told Wilkes. "Said he wanted the ground clear so he could look at the roots of the yew. Didn't tell me why." Wilkes dismissed him and turned to Miss Marple. "That tree keeps cropping up," he said. "If I didn't know better, I'd think we were chasing ghosts." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "The past does have a habit of reaching into the present, Sergeant." That evening, with the lamps lit and the village quiet, Miss Marple sat by the fire, the thread of wool on her lap. She compared it to the fabric of Henry's coat. It did not match. Nor was it from Arthur's or Julian's attire. Her gaze wandered to the coats hanging near the door. Harriet's sensible tweed, Jerry's dark navy, the Colonel's heavy brown. The fibre seemed to belong to something finer, softer, perhaps from a scarf or glove. As she pondered, Jerry entered to collect the last of the hymn books. She looked nervous, glancing at the study door before speaking. "Miss Marple," she said hesitantly, "do you think the killer might come back? I keep hearing things at night." Miss Marple regarded her kindly. "Fear often magnifies small noises, my dear, but it is always wise to be careful." She hesitated. "Tell me, were you close to Mr. Cottrell?" Jerry flushed. "Not exactly. He was kind, though. Helped me with my savings book once. He said I ought to be careful whom I trusted." When the girl had gone, Miss Marple leaned back, fingers folded neatly in her lap. The case, she thought, was beginning to arrange itself like a pattern of frost across glass. There were elements of money, of old secrets buried near a yew, of messages couched in rhyme, and somewhere in the midst of it, a murderer moved quietly, confident that their trail lay hidden beneath the snow. But Miss Marple, accustomed to the way evil could cloak itself in gentility, had no intention of letting it remain hidden for long. The frost of the previous night had turned to a brittle sunshine by mid-morning, casting diamonds across the snow and painting the rooftops in pale gold. Miss Marple walked to the village shop with the unhurried tread of someone whose thoughts ran far ahead of her steps. She paused by the notice board outside, where the latest announcement of choir practice looked oddly jaunty against the gravity of the crime still unsettling St. Mildred's parish. Inside the shop, gossip bubbled as usual. Mrs. Copley, the grocer's wife, leaned over the counter, whispering to a customer about Henry Cottrell's untimely end. "They say he was shot clean through the heart," she murmured. "Terrible thing, and at Christmas of all times. My Bert swears he saw a strange motor car near the hall on the very afternoon. Miss Marple bought a small loaf and listened with polite interest. She tucked away the remark about the car. Details, however slight, often had a way of returning later, useful as pins in a paper pattern. By noon, Sergeant Wilkes had summoned several villagers to the vicarage study. He stood beside the desk with an air of gruff authority, while Arthur Larch and Julian Bream took chairs near the fire. Jerry Palmer sat on the edge of a footstool, pale but composed. Harriet hovered by the window, clutching a handkerchief in both hands. Miss Marple, ensconced in an armchair, knitted steadily as if the meeting were a social gathering rather than an inquiry into murder. Wilkes cleared his throat. "I want each of you to tell me plainly where you were between 5 and 6 on the evening Mr. Cottrell died." He turned to Arthur first. Arthur smoothed his cuffs. "I was in the kitchen speaking with Harriet about the carol service. We heard the thud shortly after." Harriet nodded quickly. "Yes, that's true. We were going through the hymn lists." Julian followed. "I was arranging decorations in the nave until about 5:15, then came here to warm up. I saw Henry through the study door. He looked as though he were reading something." Jerry clasped her knees tightly. "I was in the vestry cleaning candle holders. I didn't come out until Wilkes arrived." The sergeant jotted notes. "None of you left your places?" A chorus of denials, though Julian hesitated a fraction before speaking. Miss Marple's eyes flicked up, noting the pause but saying nothing. Wilkes shut his notebook with a snap. "We've searched Henry's belongings again. Apart from the missing banknotes, there's little out of order. Except this." He held up a crumpled scrap of paper, retrieved from Henry's coat lining. On it, written in an untidy hand, was a line, "Look where the roots divide." Harriet gasped softly. "The roots of the yew, most likely," Wilkes agreed. "But we dug near that tree yesterday and found nothing." Miss Marple set down her knitting, her voice mild. "Sometimes, Sergeant, digging too soon merely disturbs the ground before one knows quite where to look. Roots can conceal much if one doesn't understand how they grow." Wilkes gave her a look half impatient, half respectful. "I'll keep that in mind." After the questioning, Miss Marple lingered in the hall, feigning difficulty with her scarf so she could observe the others leaving. Julian offered Jerry a reassuring word, though his glance towards the study seemed wary. Arthur strode off briskly, while Harriet remained behind to speak in hushed tones with Wilkes. The old lady noted each gesture, storing impressions like threads for later weaving. That afternoon she visited Michael Price at the church shed, where the young man was polishing a brass lantern. He flushed at sight of her but managed a respectful greeting. "I wonder," Miss Marple said gently, "whether you saw anything unusual while clearing the snow near the yew." Michael shifted. "Not really, ma'am. Just some old stones and the roots poking up. Though," he hesitated, "there was a little wooden box, half buried. I didn't open it, I swear. Mr. Cottrell took it away himself." "And when was that?" "Yesterday morning, just before the snow started again." He looked troubled. He seemed excited, like he'd found something important. Miss Marple thanked him kindly and walked back along the church path, her mind knitting together what she had learned. A box removed from near the yew, a scrap urging someone to look where the roots divide, missing money, and a revolver in careful hands. Evening crept in early, tinting the sky lavender. Inside the vicarage a fire burned low. Jerry, sent to fetch more coal, found herself alone for a moment in the study. She touched the blotter on the desk, then quickly drew back as if scorched. Harriet, coming in behind her, raised an eyebrow. "You seem nervous, Geraldine." Jerry flushed. I keep thinking about Henry sitting here, and then—" She broke off. Harriet softened slightly. "We're all unsettled, but we mustn't let fear get the better of us." Miss Marple, sitting unobtrusively in the corner, watched the exchange. "Fear, yes, but perhaps also guilt or knowledge." Jerry's hands trembled ever so slightly as she replaced the coal scuttle. That night, as snow drifted once more against the panes, Miss Marple retired to her room with her knitting bag. From its depths, she withdrew the small strand of dark wool and laid it beside a note she had copied from Wilkes's scrap. She pondered the way the words were formed, careless but not uneducated. And the wool, it was softer than any coat, fine enough for a scarf worn by someone particular about appearances. She recalled Julian's slight hesitation during the sergeant's questions, the wary glance at the study door. She also remembered Lady Hawthorne's tale about burial plots by the yew. There was a chain somewhere, running from old parish land to Henry Cotterell's death. All it needed was patience, a skill Miss Marple possessed in abundance. The next morning promised further revelations. For murder, she reflected, seldom remained dormant for long. It was a seed that, once planted, grew quickly, sending out roots to crack the surface of ordinary life, just like the great yew in the churchyard, whose gnarled branches whispered secrets even in the stillest air. The morning was overcast, a pale grey that softened the edges of the village and seemed to weigh heavily on its residents. At the vicarage the atmosphere was tense, though outwardly composed. Harriet Larch moved between rooms, arranging tea and biscuits with meticulous care, while Arthur lingered in the study, revisiting the notes and letters Henry Cotterell had left behind. Even the Colonel and Mrs. Faraday, normally cheerful companions, spoke in measured tones, conscious that the shadow of murder still hung over them. Miss Marple, as always, moved quietly through the house, observing. She paused by the drawing-room window and gazed at the frost-slick streets, noting the footprints left by morning shoppers and the faint impression of a dog's paws near the church gate. It was an ordinary scene, yet she could sense that beneath it lay a network of secrets, each connected to the tragedy of yesterday. There was a knock at the door. Harriet opened it to reveal Julian Bream, looking uneasy, his hands clasped behind his back. "May I speak with you, Miss Marple?" he asked. "Privately, if possible." They stepped into the study, leaving the others in the sitting room. Julian's eyes were restless, darting to the desk where the scrap of paper with the cryptic note still lay. I feel I should tell you something," he began. "About Henry?" "And the Hall." Miss Marple's eyes were calm, almost patient. "Do speak, Mr. Bream," he swallowed as if gathering courage. "I know he discovered something about Lady Hawthorne's affairs, something irregular. He intended to confront her about it, but I don't know exactly what. I only heard him mention it in passing to a mutual acquaintance last week." Miss Marple's needles paused in mid-air. "And this mutual acquaintance?" "Jerry Palmer. She heard part of it too. He said it had to do with old contracts, land that should have been returned to the parish but wasn't." "Interesting," Miss Marple murmured, placing her knitting aside. "And you say he intended to confront Lady Hawthorne when?" "Yesterday afternoon, just before coming to the vicarage." Julian ran a hand through his hair. "I think someone intercepted him. I didn't see it, but, well, it makes sense." Miss Marple nodded, silently cataloguing the information. "Thank you for your candor, Mr. Bream. That will help us greatly." After he left, Miss Marple stepped into the hallway to see Harriet speaking with Jerry Palmer. The girl looked anxious, fingers twisting a scarf as though it might unravel her nerves. Miss Marple approached gently. "Jerry, I believe you may have something important to tell me." The girl bit her lip. I saw someone near the hall the afternoon Henry came to speak with Lady Hawthorne. I didn't recognize them at first, but they were watching Henry, following him just out of sight. I thought it was a delivery man at first, but..." Her voice faltered. "They had gloves and a scarf. They were careful not to be seen." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "You did quite right to mention it. Now tell me, was there anything unusual about Henry's behavior that day?" Jerry thought for a moment. "He seemed hurried, nervous even, and he kept glancing at the window of the study, as if expecting someone to appear." This confirmed what Julian had hinted. Someone was indeed watching Henry, someone who wanted to ensure he did not reach the hall alive. Miss Marple's mind, ever analytical, began to construct a pattern of movements and intentions, noting which footsteps, glances, and gestures aligned and which were misdirection. Meanwhile, outside, snow had softened into a gentle drizzle. Villagers moved cautiously along the street, their conversations low. Word of Henry Cotterell's death had spread further, now accompanied by whispers of disputes over property and old contracts. Even the mildest gossip carried weight, for in small communities, rumors often revealed more than formal statements. By mid-afternoon, Sergeant Wilkes returned with news. He had visited Lady Hawthorne and questioned several of the estate staff. "Nothing conclusive yet," he admitted to Harriet and Arthur, but they mentioned seeing Henry talking with someone near the hall, and that a small package disappeared yesterday morning, something that Henry had been carrying. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. noting the overlap with what Jerry and Julian had observed. "A package, you say? Did they describe it?" "A small wooden box," Wilkes replied. "No larger than a jewel case. The gardener said he saw Henry take it from near the old yew at the churchyard." Miss Marple's fingers traced the edge of her knitting. Everything pointed back to that tree, the notes, the package, and the obscured movements around it. Whoever orchestrated Henry's demise clearly understood its significance. And yet it was more than a simple theft or revenge. There was a precision, a forethought. Later that day, Harriet Larch tried to lighten the mood by suggesting tea in the sitting room. As they gathered, conversation shifted cautiously to other topics, avoiding the immediate horrors. Yet Miss Marple detected undercurrents, glances exchanged between Julian and Harriet, a flicker of guilt in the Colonel's eyes, tension in Jerry's posture. Every subtle cue suggested unspoken truths waiting to surface. During tea, Miss Marple excused herself briefly and went to the study. She retrieved the strand of dark wool she had collected earlier and held it against the light. Fine, soft, and slightly lustrous, it could belong to a scarf or a delicate glove. She examined the scrap of paper Wilkes had shown earlier and compared the handwriting. The curves and slants spoke of impatience but also education. Whoever wrote the notes was careful, deliberate, and wanted to maintain control. Her attention shifted to the fireplace, noting the ashes of paper Henry had burned. Among the remnants, she detected the edge of a folded note partially consumed. Kneeling, she carefully extracted it. Though much of the text was illegible, a few words survived. "Trust no one." "Beneath the yew." Miss Marple sat back, her mind weaving threads together. Someone had planned Henry's encounter, observed his every move, and left behind messages to mislead or warn. And the yew, central to all the clues, contained not just a physical secret but a symbolic one, rooted in fear, tradition, and buried knowledge. Evening fell quickly, bringing with it a biting wind. Miss Marple stoked the fire, knitting calmly as if the threads of yarn could somehow untangle human duplicity. Harriet and Jerry had retired, Julian remained restless, and the Colonel was dozing near the hearth. Miss Marple reflected on what she had learned that day, the intercepted visit to Lady Hawthorne, the missing box, the cryptic notes, and the careful observation of Henry by an unknown party. Each element hinted at a deliberate orchestration. It was no spontaneous crime of passion. It was carefully timed, calculated, and informed by knowledge of human behavior. She placed the notes and wool together, considering the next step. The key, she decided, would be to observe the reactions of those closest to the deceased. Often the truth lay not in what was spoken, but in what was concealed and in small gestures that betrayed awareness. Before retiring herself, Miss Marple made one last round of the vicarage, pausing by the Christmas tree. Its ornaments reflected the firelight, glimmering like watchful eyes. Beneath its branches, small packages waited to be distributed at the carol service. One, she noticed, had been moved slightly from its original position. She adjusted it imperceptibly and stepped back. Sometimes the mere act of watching, or subtly altering circumstances, revealed more than direct questioning ever could. As the house settled into night, the wind sighed outside, carrying whispers over snow-laden streets. Miss Marple sat by the fire, knitting and reflecting. The day had brought more information, more hidden motives, and more uncertainty. Yet with patient attention, patterns were emerging. The yew, the notes, the package, and the unseen observer, all pieces of a puzzle, whose edges were now becoming visible. And Miss Marple knew, as always, that human nature, in its constancy and unpredictability, would guide her to the ultimate truth. The day broke with a pale, wintry sun, casting long, trembling shadows across the snow-laden village. Inside the vicarage, the household moved with a deliberate quiet, aware that each step, each glance was imbued with the memory of the previous day's tragedy. Miss Marple, as usual, had been awake long before anyone else, walking the frost-bitten lanes in thoughtful silence. She had noted footprints near the churchyard again, some partially obscured by overnight snow, and she had wondered whether they belonged to the person who had placed the mysterious package beneath the yew. Breakfast was subdued. Harriet Larch poured tea with practiced care, yet her hands trembled slightly as she handed the cups. Arthur hovered near the table, adjusting the silverware with an anxiety he could not fully disguise. Julian Bream was unusually silent, glancing occasionally at the study door as if expecting something or someone. Even the Colonel, ordinarily a beacon of cheerful resilience, spoke only in curt sentences, each word carefully measured. Miss Marple, knitting quietly, observed all. She noted Julian's restless movements, Harriet's minute gestures, and Jerry Palmer's slight hesitation as she carried toast to the table. Subtle cues, invisible to most, painted a vivid picture for those who knew how to read human behavior. After breakfast, a knock sounded at the door. It was Sergeant Wilkes, accompanied by a uniformed constable, both carrying notebooks. "We're continuing the inquiry," he said briskly. "There are still a few points we must clarify with each of you." They moved to the study. Wilkes addressed the group. "We have been told that a small wooden box was removed from near the yew. Has anyone seen it since yesterday morning?" Arthur shifted uneasily. "Henry took it, I believe. I did not see him after that until the incident." Julian Bream spoke quickly. "I saw Henry with something small in his hand near the yew, but he kept it hidden. I did not know what it contained." Miss Marple's fingers paused on her knitting. That confirmed her own observations. Henry had indeed collected something vital, and someone had been watching, possibly even following him. Jerry Palmer raised a tentative hand. I saw someone near the churchyard when I delivered letters, a figure in a dark coat, gloves, and scarf. They seemed to watch Henry for a few moments, and then disappeared into the lane." Wilkes jotted notes. "Interesting. Did you notice anything else? Perhaps a peculiar movement or something in their hand?" Jerry shook her head. "No, just the gloves and scarf. They didn't make a sound." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Thank you, my dear. You've been most helpful." Once Wilkes departed to follow up on these observations, Miss Marple excused herself ostensibly to inspect the study. She walked slowly, touching the edge of the carpet where Henry had fallen. Her gaze fell on the hearth, the small patch of ash where he had burned scraps of paper. Even in the flickering firelight, something caught her eye. A faint smudge, as though something sticky had adhered to the wood. She lifted it carefully with a corner of tissue. It seemed to be a trace of sealing wax, crimson and delicate. Her mind raced. The package, the notes, the wax. Someone had orchestrated a careful plan. Her deliberate removal of property, a cryptic message, and a carefully timed confrontation. Each detail reinforced the notion that Henry's death had been premeditated, executed with an awareness of human behavior, and designed to mislead anyone who might investigate. By mid-afternoon, Miss Marple ventured to the churchyard. She approached the yew, noting the exact position where the box had been found. The snow had been slightly disturbed again, though the pattern was irregular, as if someone had moved around the tree several times before retreating. Kneeling, she examined the base of the roots, her fingers brushing against the cold soil. Something pressed against her glove. She uncovered a small brass key, corroded slightly but unmistakable in design. Carefully, she tucked it into her coat pocket. Returning to the vicarage, Miss Marple found Harriet and Julian in the drawing room. "I had intended to ask," she said softly, "whether either of you saw Henry with any sort of key yesterday. Something small, perhaps brass?" Julian frowned. I didn't notice. But Henry might have had one to lock the package." Harriet hesitated, then admitted, "I saw him slip something into his pocket, yes. But I didn't think it important. He always carried keys, and I assumed it was for the hall or the vicarage doors." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "Very likely. Keys often open more than doors, you know." Later, the snow softened into a gentle sleet, pattering against windows and making the air heavy. Jerry Palmer appeared once more, this time with a stack of letters from the post office. She moved nervously, glancing toward the study. Miss Marple approached her quietly. "Jerry, have you noticed anything strange about the villagers' movements? Anyone unusually attentive to comings and goings?" The girl hesitated. "Well, Mr. Bream has been restless. He seems to watch the study sometimes when no one else is around, and I think Colonel Faraday's been asking about Henry's schedule." Miss Marple nodded. "Thank you. Observation is often the key to understanding." That evening, as the household gathered for a modest supper, Miss Marple reflected silently. The day had offered her several pieces of the puzzle: a brass key, the notes urging attention to the yew, the small box, and the behavior of those close to Henry. Each piece seemed disparate, yet she sensed an underlying design. a web connecting actions and motives in ways the others had not perceived. She lingered by the fire after the meal, pretending to arrange her knitting, while the rest of the house relaxed. Julian Bream spoke quietly with Harriet, their voices low, oblivious to the way their mannerisms betrayed their emotions. Even Jerry, sent to fetch a candle, moved with a nervous precision that spoke of secrets held tightly. Miss Marple examined the placement of the Christmas tree in the corner. Beneath its branches, the gifts rested undisturbed, save for one which had been slightly moved. Small details, she thought, were often overlooked, yet they revealed the truth if one had patience to watch. The slightest alteration in placement, a shifted parcel, a wrinkle in paper, all were whispers of human intention. As night deepened, Miss Marple sat by the window, gazing at the snow-covered village. Her mind turned over every observation: Henry's hurried visit to the hall, the box retrieved from the yew, the small key, and the cryptic notes. One thread ran consistently through them: the deliberate orchestration of his movements and the careful monitoring of his interactions. It was clear. She realized that the murderer was someone who knew Henry intimately, who understood his habits, his fears, and his routines. The planning had been precise but not infallible. Human nature, she reflected, always revealed itself, whether through a glance, a hesitation, or the smallest oversight. Before retiring for the night, Miss Marple retrieved the brass key from her coat pocket and examined it. The edges were worn as though frequently used. Perhaps it had opened the box, or perhaps it opened a door far more significant than any physical barrier, a door into the truth. She placed it carefully beside her knitting, resolved that patience, observation, and careful deduction would soon illuminate the path to the murderer. Outside, the wind moaned softly against the eaves, carrying the muted echoes of village life. Inside, the vicarage lay in relative quiet, yet tension hummed in the air. The threads were converging, and Miss Marple, as always, was ready to follow them wherever they led. The snow had softened into a slushy mist by morning, and the streets of the village glistened under a dull silver light. Miss Marple, walking to the churchyard with her coat tightly fastened and her hat low against the drizzle, observed footprints partially obscured by the sleet. Each impression told a story. Some led toward the hall, others veered around the churchyard. Patterns, she knew, were often more revealing than words. At the vicarage, the household prepared for another day of hushed conversation and careful observation. Harriet Larch moved quietly between rooms, checking the fire and arranging breakfast with deliberate calm. Arthur sat in the study, reviewing Henry Cottrell's papers once more, though his eyes were unfocused, distracted by the looming mystery. Julian Bream lingered near the window, peering toward the street as if expecting a visitor, while Jerry Palmer hovered nervously, her fingers fidgeting with a scarf. Miss Marple joined them in the breakfast room, noting each gesture. Subtle movements, she thought, often betrayed the true state of mind. A twitch of the hand, a nervous glance, a hesitation before speaking, all were clues more valuable than any spoken words. After breakfast, Miss Marple decided to visit the hall. Lady Hawthorne received her in a drawing-room warmed by a fire, the decor subdued yet elegant. "Miss Marple," she said, her tone polite but distant, "I imagine you have come about poor Henry." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied gently. "I wish to ask a few questions about yesterday afternoon. I understand Henry intended to speak with you regarding certain matters of the estate." Lady Hawthorne's lips tightened. "He did, though I cannot say what precisely he hoped to discover. He seemed troubled, and I admit I did not expect his visit." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the older woman. There was tension in her posture, a rigidity in her hands as she clasped them over her lap. "And the staff?" Miss Marple inquired softly. "Did anyone observe him arriving or departing?" "They saw him at the gate, speaking briefly with a gardener," Lady Hawthorne replied. "But I cannot say who else may have been watching." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured, making a mental note. The pattern of observations and movements continued to revolve around Henry and the hall, each piece adding subtle weight to the growing picture of motive and opportunity. Returning to the vicarage, Miss Marple examined the study with meticulous care. The strand of dark wool lay alongside the brass key and the notes she had collected over the previous days. She compared them with Henry's handwriting and possessions, deducing that the key likely opened the small wooden box removed from the yew. Yet what it contained remained a question, one intertwined with secrets that were slowly surfacing. By midday, a knock at the door heralded the arrival of Julian Bream. His expression was tense, and he avoided looking directly at Miss Marple. I thought you should know," he began, "that the gardener at the hall mentioned seeing someone slip out through the side gate yesterday afternoon. A person in dark clothing, gloves, and a scarf. They moved quickly and he did not recognize them." Miss Marple's eyes brightened. "Yes, that coincides with what Jerry Palmer observed near the churchyard." She paused. "It seems someone was careful to remain unseen yet consistently present." Julian's hands fidgeted. "I cannot tell you who. I did not see their face, but it was deliberate." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "The deliberate nature of this crime is apparent. Each movement, each placement was controlled to mislead those who might observe, and yet the smallest misstep reveals more than the cleverest plan." Later, the vicarage received another visitor, Michael Price, the church handyman. His coat was damp from the drizzle, and he seemed nervous. I thought I should tell you, Miss Marple," he said, "that while clearing snow yesterday I noticed the package near the yew had been moved. Not by me, but someone else. They left footprints and they went toward the lane by the hall." Miss Marple's mind pieced together the sequence, the collection of the box by Henry, the movement near the yew, and the mysterious figure observed by both Jerry and Julian. Someone had orchestrated events carefully, ensuring the package changed hands while maintaining secrecy. As dusk fell, Miss Marple prepared for a visit to the village shop, ostensibly to purchase candles. Inside, Mrs. Copley and a few villagers were gathered, speaking in hushed tones about the murder and the peculiar events surrounding it. Miss Marple listened politely, absorbing every detail. She noted references to a motor car parked near the hall, speculation about blackmail, and mentions of an argument overheard near the gate. Each story, filtered through the lens of gossip, still contained kernels of truth. Returning to the vicarage, she was met by Harriet, who suggested they prepare for the carol rehearsal despite the unsettled atmosphere. Miss Marple agreed, noting the way Harriet's hands trembled slightly as she gathered hymn books. Even in ordinary tasks, anxiety revealed itself. During the rehearsal, Miss Marple positioned herself near the back, observing the interactions between villagers. Julian Bream's glances were restless. The Colonel's attention occasionally wandered, and Jerry Palmer seemed preoccupied, her voice faltering at times. Each nuance contributed to the tapestry Miss Marple was weaving in her mind. She noted who stood where, who spoke with whom, and who avoided certain areas, patterns invisible to all but a trained observer. After rehearsal, she lingered near the Christmas tree, examining the placement of ornaments and parcels. One parcel, she noticed, had shifted slightly from its original spot. The movement was subtle, yet deliberate, as though someone had checked its contents or confirmed its location. Miss Marple adjusted it with care, her mind cataloguing possibilities. Later that evening, the vicarage settled into quiet. The storm outside had intensified, wind whistling around the eaves and snow drifting against the windows. Miss Marple sat by the fire, knitting slowly, reflecting on the events of the day. The evidence, though fragmented, began to form a coherent pattern. The movement of the package, the cryptic notes, the brass key, and the mysterious observer all pointed toward premeditation. She considered the motives. Henry Cottrell had discovered something about Lady Hawthorne's estate, or perhaps the hidden dealings of others in the village. Someone aware of this knowledge acted to prevent disclosure, yet the choice of method, leaving clues to mislead and to reveal selectively, indicated a mind both cunning and confident in its ability to manipulate human observation. As midnight approached, Miss Marple made her final round of the vicarage, pausing once more at the Christmas tree. Beneath its branches lay the gifts, undisturbed except for the one parcel she had adjusted earlier. The arrangement of the tree and the placement of objects in the room were themselves part of the scene she was studying. Minor details often revealed truths the untrained eye missed. Sitting finally by the fire, Miss Marple contemplated the threads now clearly forming in her mind. The next day promised further revelations, yet she knew patience was essential. Human nature, consistent in its patterns of deception and inadvertent confession, would guide her to the truth. The murderer, confident in their concealment, would soon reveal the smallest sign of guilt, An instinctive gesture, a fleeting glance, a hesitation too long. Miss Marple, with her keen understanding of observation and psychology, was prepared to notice. The web of secrets surrounding Henry Cotterell's death was intricate, yet not impervious. Each action, each subtle cue, brought her closer to uncovering the hidden design. And as the wind howled outside and snow draped the village in white, she remained calm, knowing that in time the pattern would emerge, and the careful orchestration of human motives and misdeeds would be fully revealed. The following morning dawned bright and clear, the sunlight glinting off the remaining snow, but the air was sharp and biting. The village moved slowly, as if still weighed down by the events of the past week. Miss Marple, walking deliberately to the churchyard, noted the footprints near the yew. Some were familiar. Others, newer and deeper, betrayed the passage of someone heavier or more deliberate. She traced them with her eyes, the puzzle pieces beginning to arrange themselves into a more complete picture. Inside the vicarage, the household prepared for another day of quiet observation. Harriet moved with her usual precision, arranging tea and small trays of biscuits. Arthur reviewed Henry's papers, though his concentration was broken by anxious glances toward the study. Julian Bream seemed restless, pacing near the window, and Jerry Palmer's unease was visible in the way she fidgeted with her scarf. Even the colonel, normally impervious to concern, was subdued, his voice low and clipped. Miss Marple observed all, noting each subtle shift in posture and expression. Human behavior, she knew, rarely deceived. Even when words did, a twitch of a hand, a glance that lingered too long, hesitation before speaking, these small signs often revealed truths far more reliably than statements given under pressure. At mid-morning, Sergeant Wilkes arrived, notebook in hand. He called the household together in the study, his voice brisk. "We've followed up the leads regarding the small wooden box removed from the yew. Unfortunately, it hasn't been found, but we've traced the movements near the hall. Witnesses confirm seeing a figure in dark clothing, gloves and scarf slipping away through the side gate." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "Yes, that corresponds with the observations of both Jerry Palmer and Mr. Bream." Wilkes shifted slightly. "Indeed, it seems someone was careful, deliberate, and yet, strangely, they may have left traces." Miss Marple inclined her head, recalling the faint smudge of sealing wax at the vicarage hearth, the brass key she had found near the yew, and the cryptic notes urging attention to the roots. Each detail, she understood, was placed not haphazardly, but as part of a careful orchestration designed to mislead and control the perceptions of others. Jerry Palmer, summoned to clarify her observations, described again the figure she had seen. "They were very deliberate, Miss Marple. They seemed to know exactly where Henry would go, and yet I think they hesitated for a moment near the lane, like they were checking something." Miss Marple nodded. "A pause often tells us more than action. It indicates awareness and intent, even concern." Later in the day, Miss Marple visited Lady Hawthorne at the hall. The older woman received her with the usual politeness, yet a tension lingered in her expression. "I imagine you wish to know more about Henry's visit yesterday," she said. "Yes," Miss Marple replied softly. "Did Henry receive or remove anything from the hall? Perhaps something small, easily concealed?" Lady Hawthorne's lips tightened. I'm not certain. He did ask about some old deeds and contracts, and I believe he had a small box with him, though I cannot recall what it contained. The servants would know, but they are cautious." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, her mind cataloguing the implications. "And the package from the churchyard. Was it ever returned to the hall?" Lady Hawthorne shook her head. "I cannot say. I only know it was not here when I checked yesterday evening." On her return, Miss Marple paused by the Christmas tree in the vicarage hall. Beneath its branches lay parcels undisturbed, save one that had been slightly shifted. The placement was subtle, yet she recognized it as a deliberate action, intended either to test observation or to mislead. Such attention to minor details was a hallmark of the person responsible for Henry's death. That evening, as the household gathered for supper, the tension remained palpable. Conversations were subdued, punctuated by careful glances and muted questions. Julian Bream spoke quietly with Harriet, their faces betraying concern despite their measured tones. Jerry Palmer seemed distracted, her thoughts elsewhere, while Arthur and the colonel appeared absorbed in contemplation. Miss Marple, sitting near the fire with her knitting, reflected on the events that had unfolded. The brass key, the notes, the wooden box, and the movements around the hall and the yew created a pattern of deliberate misdirection. Someone had been watching Henry carefully, understanding his habits and routines yet leaving subtle traces. The murderer had been confident, calculating and meticulous in planning. But human nature, she knew, could not be fully suppressed. Later, when the others had retired, Miss Marple examined the scrap of paper Wilkes had found and the faint traces of wax from the hearth. Holding them together, she considered the sequence of actions. Henry removing the package, being observed and ultimately intercepted. The threads were converging. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, revealing a careful orchestration that had gone unnoticed by all but the most observant. Miss Marple then turned her attention to the small brass key. Its worn edges suggested frequent use, perhaps to secure the box. Yet the contents remained a mystery. What could have prompted such careful planning, such deliberate observation? She speculated on the possibilities. Money, letters, evidence of misdeeds, or something far more personal, capable of provoking fear or anger, sufficient to incite murder. As midnight approached, the wind picked up outside, rattling the windows and sending snow swirling against the panes. Inside, the vicarage was quiet, but Miss Marple remained vigilant. She moved from room to room, noting the arrangement of furniture, the slight shifts in objects and the subtle signs of attention that had been paid or overlooked. Human behavior, after all, was never fully concealed, even when one attempted to act with precision. In the quiet of the night, she reflected on the motives she had uncovered. Henry Cottrell had discovered something of importance, perhaps a secret concerning Lady Hawthorne's estate, or an irregularity in parish dealings. Someone, aware of his knowledge and movements, had acted to prevent disclosure. The murderer's confidence, while impressive, contained small flaws easily observable to a mind trained in human nature. Miss Marple considered each suspect. Julian Bream, with his restless glances and subtle anxieties. Lady Hawthorne, whose tensions suggested hidden knowledge. Arthur Larch, meticulous yet disturbed by the events. And even those who appeared most innocent, like Jerry Palmer, whose observations had proven crucial. Each had connections to the central mystery, yet one in particular had acted with the calculated precision that indicated direct involvement. Before retiring, Miss Marple visited the Christmas tree once more. Beneath its branches, the gifts and decorations lay in calm repose, yet she noted the slight disarray of a parcel moved previously. Small actions often revealed larger truths, she reminded herself. Observation, patience, and careful consideration would soon expose the deliberate orchestration behind Henry Cottrell's death. She sat by the fire, knitting slowly, pondering the web of human motives. Every movement, glance, and hesitation she had observed formed a pattern now recognizable, though not yet complete. The threads would soon converge, and the smallest cue, a flicker of fear, a fleeting glance, a pause too long, would reveal the identity of the murderer. Outside, the wind moaned through the village, carrying the chill and the quiet anticipation of revelation. Inside, the vicarage remained calm in appearance, but Miss Marple's mind worked tirelessly, tracing the paths of suspicion, motives, and opportunity. The endgame approached, and she, with the gentle persistence and insight that had long characterized her understanding of human nature, was prepared to guide events to their inevitable conclusion. The village awoke to a pale winter sun, casting soft light over snow-laden streets. There was a stillness in the air, a quiet anticipation that seemed to pervade every house. Miss Marple, as always, had been awake for hours, considering the events that had led to Henry Cottrell's death and the intricate web of human behavior surrounding it. The threads had grown clearer over the past days, and now the final pattern was within reach. At the vicarage, breakfast passed in subdued conversation. Harriet moved with her usual careful precision, though her hands trembled slightly as she poured tea. Julian Bream remained near the window, restless, while Jerry Palmer hovered quietly, eyes occasionally glancing at the door. Arthur Larch and the Colonel were already discussing the day's arrangements, though their voices were low and uncertain. Miss Marple noted each gesture and glance, storing them as though threading beads on a string, waiting for the final knot to form. By mid-morning, she requested the household gather in the study. The reason, she said, was a discussion of Henry's final movements, though no one suspected the true purpose. The room seemed to grow heavier with tension as they assembled. Miss Marple's calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the unease that lingered in the air. "I believe," she began gently, "that it is time we considered the events surrounding Henry Cottrell's last day with care. We may find that the simplest observations reveal the most." Her eyes rested briefly on each of the assembled figures. Noting reactions, micro-expressions, and minute hesitations, she turned first to Julian Bream. "You observed Henry near the hall, and you noticed something unusual, did you not?" Julian shifted in his chair. "Yes, he seemed uneasy, and there was someone else watching him from a distance." Miss Marple nodded. "Indeed, and you, Jerry Palmer, observed a figure near the yew. Someone in gloves and a dark scarf, careful not to be seen. Both observations, though seemingly minor, are crucial, for it appears that someone was determined to monitor Henry's movements without alerting him or anyone else." Her gaze then fell upon Harriet. "You noticed Henry with something small, perhaps a key or a package, did you not?" Harriet swallowed. "Yes, I saw him slip a small box into his pocket, but I did not think it important." Miss Marple allowed a gentle pause, letting the information settle while observing the reactions. She then spoke of the brass key, the cryptic note urging attention to the roots of the yew, and the small wooden box removed from the churchyard. "Each element," she said, "was part of a deliberate orchestration. Someone carefully planned the sequence of events, observing Henry, controlling his movements, and ultimately ensuring his death." She stood and moved to the Christmas tree in the corner of the room, adjusting the slightly displaced parcel. "Even here, under the guise of holiday festivity, evidence may be found. Small details often betray great intent. A moved parcel, the faint residue of wax, even the soft texture of a forgotten woolen thread. These things are not random." Then she turned to Julian Bream, whose hands were trembling slightly. "Mr. Bream, do you understand the significance of your hesitation during Sergeant Wilkes's questioning? The subtle avoidance of the study door." Julian's face paled. I didn't mean... I was only concerned." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Precisely. Concern, yes, but it betrayed knowledge. And knowledge, when paired with opportunity, can reveal a great deal." Her attention then moved to Lady Hawthorne, whose posture stiffened imperceptibly. "You knew Henry had discovered irregularities in the estate, did you not? You knew that he intended to confront you or others regarding deeds and contracts." The older woman's lips tightened, and her hands, clasped tightly, trembled ever so slightly. Miss Marple turned back to the room as a whole. "The person responsible for Henry Cottrell's death acted with premeditation. They observed, manipulated, and controlled circumstances, confident that their careful planning would prevent discovery. Yet human nature, consistent in its patterns, provides subtle signs. The hesitation, the glance, the small act of misplacement, all reveal more than calculated words." She paused, letting the weight of her observations sink in. Then, with deliberate calm, she addressed the true culprit. "It was you, Julian Bream. You followed Henry from the hall to the churchyard, you ensured he collected the box, and then, most critically, you intercepted him before he could confront Lady Hawthorne. The package contained evidence of misdeeds, documents revealing misappropriation of property, and perhaps even financial irregularities that would have exposed you as much as anyone else involved. Your gloves and scarf were intended to conceal your identity, but your nervous movements betrayed you." Julian's face drained of color. "No, I didn't mean to. I only wanted to protect myself." Miss Marple nodded. "Indeed, and in attempting to control the situation, you acted with fatal consequence. The revolver was taken from the box's contents, used swiftly, and then returned to its hiding place near the yew. Yet you overlooked the smallest details, the slight disarray of the parcel under the Christmas tree, the smudge of wax, the worn brass key. All of these were, in combination, evidence that led here." Jerry Palmer, her eyes wide, whispered, I saw you, Julian. I didn't know what to do." Julian slumped in his chair, defeated. "It was supposed to be simple. He couldn't expose what I knew. I didn't mean to kill him. I only meant to scare him." Miss Marple's expression softened. Fear and desperation often lead to acts we cannot reverse. The truth, however, always finds its way, and human nature, observed carefully, cannot hide even the most cunning intent indefinitely. She then addressed the rest of the household. It is important, as always, to reflect on what this reveals about us all. Secrets, ambition, and fear are universal, but they manifest differently in each person. In this case, they were manipulated with deadly effect. Outside, the wind had settled, leaving the village crisp and bright. Inside the vicarage, the resolution brought a quiet sense of relief, tempered by the gravity of the revelation. The villagers absorbed the truth slowly, some in shock, others in muted sorrow, but all aware that the hidden currents beneath their peaceful community had been laid bare. Miss Marple, sitting quietly by the fire, reflected on human nature, its constancy and its unpredictability. She considered Henry Cottrell, whose curiosity and dedication to justice had brought him into fatal proximity to deceit, and Julian Bream, whose ambition and fear had led him to destroy a life he might have preserved. Harriet and Jerry remained nearby, helping to restore calm and order, while Arthur and the Colonel discussed practical matters in hushed tones. The vicarage, though forever marked by recent events, would continue to serve as a place of quiet observation and reflection. And Miss Marple, as always, would carry the lessons of human nature with her, understanding that beneath the ordinary surface of the village lay passions, fears and motives as complex as any in the grandest of cities. Later that evening, Miss Marple walked once more to the Christmas tree, adjusting the remaining parcels. The ornaments reflected the firelight, sparkling like watchful eyes, a reminder that even the smallest detail mattered. Beneath the branches, the village's tranquility had returned. Though subtly altered, aware now of the shadows that accompany ambition, secrecy, and fear, she thought of the you, of the roots beneath which secrets had literally and figuratively been buried. The murder, while shocking, had revealed the intricate layers of human behavior, demonstrating that the truth, though delayed, emerges inevitably. As night fell over the village, Miss Marple settled by the fire with her knitting. Outside, the quiet snow muffled the world, leaving only the soft crackle of flames and the subtle rhythm of thoughtful reflection. The case was resolved, yet the lessons endured. Human nature, even in its quietest forms, is never as simple as it seems. Observation, patience, and understanding remain the keys to uncovering truth. And in that, Miss Marple had once again quietly triumphed, and so the village of St. Mildred's returned to its usual routines, the air tinged with unease but tempered by the resolution of a mystery long concealed. The Christmas tree remained, decorated and steadfast, a symbol of both festivity and the silent truths it had witnessed. Miss Marple, calm and composed, reflected that the world of human motives was far more intricate than any puzzle or pattern in her knitting. But for those patient enough to watch, to observe, and to consider the subtleties of human behavior, the truth was always discernible. The case of Henry Cottrell's murder was concluded, but the quiet, steady work of understanding human nature would continue, as it always had, in the heart of the village and the mind of Miss Jane Marple.